Welcome back. Checkmate, Lincolnites. Was Sherman... The fuck did I just say? Was General Sherman a war criminal? Was Sherman a war criminal? Well, this is part 2. I went back a little bit so we could read that, whoever it was. It was a crazy comment. Let's move the video.
Means an unpopular opinion among your rampaging Yankee soldiers. Many Northerners spoke openly of exterminating the people of the South and civilizing the Confederacy as though it was some sort of southward manifest destiny. And when the brave women of our fair South dared resist them, lying Lincolnites and dirty blue bellies inflicted unspeakable suffering upon them and rejoiced at their misery. As one of Sherman's cavalry generals told Virginia Wade, a prominent South Carolina gentlewoman,
"We shall soon see the women of Carolina as those of Georgia, with tears, begging crusts from our men for their famishing children. Oh, it was glorious to see such a sight. You women keep up this war. We are fighting you."
Yeah, that's pretty fucked. Though we may want to mention here that rich Southern ladies were probably more vicious in their hatred for and condemnation of Union soldiers than their Confederate husbands were. You're justifying it. Not at all. Just seeking to understand it. I tell you, the Yankee invasion was murderous and vile, and the rights of human nature were deeply wounded by this infamous practice. Consider your own wounds, Mr. Johnny Reb, for you are its practitioner. Confederate leaders fully understood that to win the war, they would need to wage it as savagely as possible. They could never match the North for numbers, but what they could do was cause enough mayhem to convince the Northern public that Union wasn't worth the cost of war.
Dating back to the Mexican-American War, which was 1846 to 48. In that war, it was like an ungodly number. 75% of the military was from the South. And that pretty much it carried on. So, when the South started the war, they had more of the professional soldiers. And so, those initial battles when they were winning based on people who had been in fights. And a lot of the North just didn't have those kind of people, but they did have experienced leaders. But they didn't have the men who had been through it before. That was also another big, powerful thing. Of course, once those people were killed off and they were replaced with people who didn't have quite the same experience, and you're going against bigger numbers, it just will eventually wear you down.
Before he had even left the United States Senate in January 1861, Jefferson Davis promised the North that
"A torch and sword can do their work with dreadful havoc, and starving millions would weep at the stupidity of those who had precipitated them into so sad a policy."
Confederates dreamed of laying waste to the North, even after the tide of war had turned against them. In November 1864, Confederate agents tried to burn New York City to the ground by lighting 10 fires in hotels all across Manhattan. Pro-Confederate newspapers called for violent, invasive reprisals on the North, often and loudly.
"Let Yankee cities burn and their fields be laid waste.
Let the Negro worshippers have a taste of what we have experienced for 2 years."
The most successful instance of Confederate revenge was Jubal Early's destruction of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania in July of 1864. Unlike cities that Sherman burned down, Chambersburg didn't have any strategic or symbolic value. Early destroyed it because he was pissed, and it was there. Confederates burned down 300 buildings, robbed civilians at gunpoint, and even shot rifle rounds into their houses. And though Confederate opportunities to desolate the North were few and far between, that was always their intention, and it made a lot of strategic sense. As Stonewall Jackson himself said in September of 1862, as he imagined a hypothetical invasion of Pennsylvania,
"We must destroy industrial establishments wherever we find them, break up their lines of interior commercial intercourse, close the coal mines, seize and, if necessary, destroy the manufactories and commerce of Philadelphia and of other large cities within our reach. Take and hold the narrow neck of the country between Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, subsist mainly on the country we traverse, and make an unrelenting war amidst their homes. Force the people of the North to understand what it will cost them to hold the South and the Union at bayonet's point.
If Stonewall Jackson were in charge, the South would have easily won the so-called Civil War. Would have taken a couple weeks at most. Sherman was only good at burning down old widows' houses. He would send other generals after Forrest to go get beat. He didn't go himself because Nathan would have just bitch slapped him off his horse. That would have been embarrassing for him. Probably would have started crying.
The fuck you just say?
Billy Hank, that's not funny. Put the gun down, please.
No, really, I couldn't hear you. Why don't you say that again?
Please. I don't.
Say it! Fucking say it!
Okay.
I said, Sherman was only good at burning down old ladies' houses.
That's actually a common misconception. A lot of people seem to have this idea that Sherman's campaigns in 1864 were purely destructive and terroristic rather than strategic and tactical, but that's simply not true. During the Atlanta campaign, when Sherman fought Confederates under Johnston and later Hood, certainly the Union Army wrecked shit, but otherwise, it was a fairly conventional military operation. Destruction was by no means their main objective. A lot is made of Sherman's capture and subsequent burning of Atlanta, but people seem to forget that John Bell Hood's Confederates burned factories and munitions as they were retreating, before Sherman even got there. And when Sherman did burn down Atlanta in November of 1864, he specifically targeted infrastructure of military value. Though, of course, homes were caught up in the conflagration, and Union troops didn't really care.
That campaign aside, Sherman marched to the sea unopposed, from Atlanta to Savannah without a single major military engagement.
That was by design. Sherman marched across Georgia with his army in two columns, each threatening various cities along their route. When Confederate forces would gather in one city or another to try to defend it, the columns would turn abruptly at the last moment toward another target. Sherman didn't even tell his own soldiers what he was planning in that respect. This meant that these disparate Confederate units could never effectively combine to present Sherman with a serious challenge. This fit in with Sherman's whole strategy of a brief, dirty war that would end the fighting as soon as possible. Attacking the resource-rich countryside of Georgia and the Carolinas had another purpose too, because those very same farms that Sherman burned down had been feeding Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia for the past 3 years. So, by destroying these places, Sherman could actively aid Ulysses S. Grant's war effort in the Eastern Theater and bring about the end of the war sooner. So the March to the Sea was not mindless destruction by any means. It was just cold and calculated.
In your eagerness to defend him, you ignore Sherman's most dastardly act during the war. The act that made the March to the Sea look like child's play.
It probably wasn't as bad as you think it was, but it was about the most egregious act of destruction ever committed by the regular Union Army, so it's important we talk about it. You ready to tell this story?
Oh, I was born ready.
In February 1865, Sherman's army approached Columbia, South Carolina, the birthplace of Southern secession. The boys in blue were eager to wreak vengeance on this symbolic heart of the Confederacy, and as they marched, many sang, "Hail Columbia, happy land, if we don't burn you, I'll be damned."
On February 16th, Sherman's men came within sight of the city. He ordered his men to occupy it and destroy public buildings, factories, and railroad property, but to spare private dwellings.
Early the next morning, Confederate troops under General Wade Hampton abandoned the city, setting fire to bales of cotton as they fled.
Over the next few hours, the damnable Yankees entered the city and found it in chaos. Citizens looted storefronts, and many black men greeted the soldiers with jugs of liquor.
By around noon, the vanguard of the occupying force was pretty much wasted. They began to barge into private homes searching for valuables.
30 or 40 drunk soldiers gathered in the State House and voted to repeal secession before defacing the statue of John C. Calhoun.
Okay, that's funny.
After sundown, the disorder became much less restrained. Black men led
It became less restrained. It was already pretty hectic.
Union soldiers to the homes of certain slave owners, including the house of a man who used a pack of bloodhounds to track down escaped slaves. They burned his house down, killed the dogs, and the black men took turns flogging him.
Stop smiling!
I wasn't. Wow.
By midnight, fires raged across the city, the biggest being nearly 9 blocks long. On Plain Street, the Yankees burned the house of a landlord whose hobby was to collect historic artifacts. The blaze consumed thousands of fossils, a collection of ancient coins, and a series of priceless paintings.
There were few murders, though women and children fleeing the chaos were taunted and threatened. Black people were especially vulnerable. At least one black man was shot dead by Union soldiers in the street for perceived impudence. No one was charged for this killing, though thousands of Union soldiers were arrested by their comrades for other offenses. At least 2 Union soldiers were shot dead by their commanding officers for crimes during the riot.
As Sherman walked through the burning streets at 3 o'clock in the morning, he came across a reverend who dared to suggest that burning down a city full of women and children might not be a very moral thing to do. Sherman replied,
Your governor is responsible for this. Who ever heard of an evacuated city to be left a depot of liquor for an enemy to occupy? Now my men have got drunk and have got beyond my control, and this is the result.
Earlier that evening, Sherman had watched the light of the fire from his headquarters and remarked to a subordinate,
They have brought it on themselves.
I gotta hand it to you, man. That is some seriously heartless shit.
See? He was a war criminal. I win. I win. So that's what that feels like. At last, my long-suffering people, the wealthy plantation owners, have won a contest against the Yankee invader. It's not much, but it's victory. Oh, I feel terrific. In your face, Billy Yank. Sherman was evil, and that's that.
It's not really that simple.
Oh, come on!
The question of do the ends justify the means can never really be answered. I'll save that for the YouTubers who talk about philosophy. But from a purely historical perspective, Sherman was right. He broke the back of the Confederacy, hastened the end of the bloodshed, and undoubtedly saved more lives than he destroyed.
That's pure speculation.
Not really. His methods were effective, and the words and actions of Confederates proves it. In the month after the fall of Columbia, 8% of the Army of Northern Virginia deserted. James Longstreet's corps actually had to set a stronger picket guard in its rear to prevent desertion than in its front to protect against the enemy. And the number one cause of desertion? The news of Sherman's march and the desolation that these soldiers' families and communities had suffered at home. Among the people of the South, the desire for peace had outgrown the desire for independence. As Georgian author Eliza Francis Andrews put it,
I used to feel very brave about Yankees, but since I have passed over Sherman's track and seen what devastation they have made, I am so afraid of them that I believe I should drop down dead if one of the wretches should come into my presence.
Damn Yankees! Rebel yell! 70% did not fight for slavery, FFS. The reason you are so lost in rhetoric is verging on weird. We need no false, rewritten lies of the War of Northern Aggression. What about the slaves in Alamo days? Or the ones in North in wartime? Oh, bullshit. Sherman's a war criminal, and ask Indians how good and decent Yankees were. Ask Apache or Sioux, you jerk Billy clown. Rebel yell!
you know, you actually raise a good point.
Yes, that only Northerners ever did anything bad to any Indian after the Civil War. No Southerner ever did anything bad to any Indian ever.
What? No, that's not... So Sherman, he was commanding general of the United States Army from 1869 to 1883, at the height of the Indian Wars in the West. Sherman didn't like this gig all that much. It was a lot different than the Civil War for sure, but it was also more of a political position than a military one. He spent most of the time lobbying on behalf of the Army in Washington, and he found the whole thing pretty distasteful. But it's undeniable
that he was a willing participant in manifest destiny at its nastiest. Sherman wasn't a religious man, but he did believe fervently in the promise of America as a world power. He viewed himself as an instrument of history, and just as he believed during the war that the downfall of slavery was inevitable and that these United States would become the United States, so he also believed that it was inevitable that white Americans would conquer the West from hostile natives by any means necessary. Sherman happily broke treaties and insisted that tribes become civilized, knowing full well that that would lead to their dissolution as cultures and polities. Contrary to popular belief, a lot of white people at the time were not cool with this, and Sherman caught a lot of flack from bleeding heart Easterners due to his severe Western policies. But he insisted that it was all for the national good. He believed that his career during the Indian Wars was a direct extension of his Civil War service, and ultimately it was the same struggle. In Sherman's mind, he was an agent of progress, and his justification for everything he did was to bring about his vision of a strong, united, triumphant America that would enter the 20th century.
Well, just like that, we're going to end on a downer.
Do one of your funny comments.
Oh, no, I don't think that's
Oh,
appropriate.
come on, give us one.
No, really.
Do it, do it, do it, do it. Crazy comment
Oh, well,
time.
if you insist, then this time the war will be spiritual. This time it will come from space. I will help. I will come from space, from another galaxy. This time y'all will not overcome us. We will overcome you for all eternity. Your technology has no power. There's a higher technology. Once they communicate with us, your life, your time is over. You will fall by the sword.
Dude, what the fuck?
So I like that. I'm pretty sure some people won't. I enjoyed it. I got this book here. The Life of Johnny Reb and The Life of Billy Yank. It's combined. I haven't read it. But it's basically what each one went through in their time serving. Well, I like that. It was funny. I think he tried to be fair, which is all you can ask for. I'm sure some won't agree. But it was funny. I liked it. I'm going to go ahead and end this here. And I'm going to find my next video. But until then, have a good day. Have a good night.